Good morning, everyone. This is Richard Capone, and I want to welcome you to our Data Interpretation for DORA webinar. This is sort of the fun part of taking a look at DORA data because we get to actually look at the data and interpret it. I think a lot of times we're used to looking at scores, but not really making the most of it. All right, so as far as the agenda, doing the introduction right now, I'm going to be talking about the model of assessment, and then we're going to jump in and start interpreting the individual subtests. And then we're going to basically do questions and answer. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start. So the first slide I like starting with is the A and the I. This stands for assessment and instruction, right? This is the normal cycle that we're using. Teachers will assess students, they'll instruct students, they get feedback, and it's a continuous loop. We like bringing this up because this is important, just to distinguish how Let's Go Learn and how DORA was specifically built. When you take a look at assessments, there are diagnostic assessments, there are formative or summative assessments, excuse me, and that's really going to be like your state accountability test. That'll be your benchmark assessments, right? Where we fall is under the diagnostic and formative area, right? And so I think it's important to note that just because a lot of times people get confused on what exactly is DORA. Now, sometimes some people may be using DORA to sort of gauge students on a grade level basis per year, but really it's designed to be a diagnostic assessment. Now, more importantly, if you notice the standards, notice how we have the standards on a dotted line on the outside. That's because we see the standards as something that sometimes changes depending on the state, but in I guess the decade, I could say. But that's something where you're working towards. You are working towards getting students up to standards. But when it comes to reading, there's still 44 sounds, 26 letters. There's still a way you teach reading that sort of transcends standards. All right. Now, this is the model under which we're operating and under which we were designed. Now, before we begin, I do want to talk a little bit about test bias. And so real quickly, let me go ahead and this is an old assessment. I like showing old assessments because you can see test bias real easily. Now, take a look at this first question here, this first row. And so I'm going to give you if we look at this is supposed to be a listening comprehension assessment. Right? So what I want you to think about is how would your students do with this particular, if they had this listening comprehension assessment, that first row. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll question. Okay, it looks like, and this is exactly what I would expect. Most of you said you didn't think they'd be able to know it because they don't know the spool or the safety pin, right? So it's a matter of vocabulary and not culturally relevant, and also maybe both. So this is exactly right. The reason why I brought up this question for us to look at is because it shows that in an assessment like this, it's supposed to be a listening comprehension assessment. It's really not a listening comprehension assessment. It's also testing vocabulary and it's testing cultural relevancy. So the problem with assessments is that it's very hard to isolate one skill. Now, with that said, DORA has biases as well. So we're going to talk about those biases. And so I think it's really important because as you use DORA or your teachers use DORA, you need to consider how are we designed and what do each of the subtests mean, all right? All right, let me just, and actually I realized I did something a little bit out of order, but let me just have two more slides just real quickly reiterating something about the standards model. In a normal standards model of assessment, you're going to have, you're going to look at a grade level sliver at a time. And you may not look at all the subtests, but just I want everyone to make sure they know that DORA follows a diagnostic model assessment. So that means when we look at high frequency words, we see where the student's at. If they don't know their grade level high frequency words, we go down to a lower level. If they still don't know, we keep going down. Then maybe we move on to phonics, we move on to word rec. And the idea is we keep going up and down until we find an instructional point. An instructional point is mastery with a non-mastery above it. So we slide up and down. This is important because in a diagnostic model, we need to know what students can do and what they cannot do and where their instructional points may lie. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I think that's a really important distinction. And that's why DORA can actually be used across many grade levels because it adapts up and down. It doesn't necessarily say, okay, I'm only going to give you fourth grade items or fourth grade passages. It says, well, let's see what you can do. Let's keep going up. All right. With that said, right now I'm going to start showing you the subtest. And by the way, I don't know if you realize, but this training we're doing right now, a lot of times when we do on-site data interpretation trainings, we'll do a 6-hour training. And in those trainings, we actually have the teachers take the assessments, and it's a really good exercise. And we take our time, and then we also start looking at students' data together as a group. So it's something to consider, in the future. If you ever want to have a longer one, obviously depends where you're located, and obviously on-site PD costs dollars, but it's just something to consider because I think making the most of the data, and especially for groups of teachers, is really important. Okay. This first subtest is high frequency words, and this subtest is, basically when they first start, they do get a practice question, and it'll say practice question, and it explains what they have to do. You're going to hear a word, click on the word as quickly as you can. But right now, for the demo purposes, I'm just jumping right in there, so I don't want you to get alarmed. This is not how the assessment is presented. Okay, so once they do the sample question, they hear the word the, and the student has to click on the word. Now, this subtest is timed. Okay, so what that means is if they try to decode this, the, click, it'll be incorrect. They have to answer within about 4 seconds after hearing the word, or it's incorrect. Now, that's because by definition of sight word mastery, it has to be immediate word recognition. They need to see it and know it right away. We don't want them decoding it. Now, this subtest works in sets of 8. So again, that gives you an idea about how reliable it is. We're not just doing one question saying, oh, they missed it, they don't know first grade sight words. No, we work in sets of 8. They get all 8 right, and we move up to a harder set, or maybe we're going back down. The grade level range of the subtest is 0.5 to 3.83. So kindergarten to high 3rd grade. Now, the grade score range only goes up to 3rd grade because in theory, we're not teaching high frequency words after 3rd grade. So hopefully that makes sense. Another thing about this subtest as well is just be aware, like I said, about the fact that it has a limit. Only goes up to high 3rd grade, and it is timed. So what that means in terms of a bias is if a student doesn't know how to use the mouse, then potentially that could be making the score artificially low. Or if the student didn't listen to the instructions and they just really clicked on it without really paying attention, or they took their time and they're being distracted. So that's one of the things to be aware of. There could be times where the score could be artificially low. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the next subtest. Once the student has a mastery level, we know where they're at, we then determine which is the next subtest they should jump into.
Bear.
This here, by the way, is the interface for grades 4 through 7. The previous one was K through 3, so the interface does change depending on the grade level of the student. Now here, these words are, this score goes all the way up to 12th grade. Now, these are not sight words, but they're common words. They hear the word bear, you have to click on it. Again, this one is giving them a set of items. These are 10 items per set. Let's say somebody a 3rd grader was given a 3rd grade set of words and they mastered all of them. Maybe it jumps up to 5th grade. Maybe it jumps up to 8th grade. It jumps up in different size steps. Now, this is sort of interesting, though. This subtest is word recognition out of context. So when a student nails down decoding, which will happen around 3rd and 4th grade, you will see this score just shoot up. So you can see 3rd and 4th graders who will have a 11th or 12th grade word rec score. But remember, we're not saying they could read at that level. This subtest is testing word recognition out of context. So don't be alarmed if you see the score shoot up. That's normal. But I would, if you see 5th graders who don't have really, really high, then you know that there is something going on. Anyway, we'll take a look at some scores afterwards, but I just want you to be aware of that. Click on the item, then it goes to the next item. All right, so after word recognition is going to be
Nap.
Onyx. Now, this is the grades 8 and above subtest, so it works on phonics principles. This particular one we're looking at is short vowel. Students get 10 items per principle. If someone started at short vowel and they got all of them right, maybe we would then go up to another principle. Maybe we'd go to long vowel, consonant blends, something else. Maybe go up to diphthongs eventually. If not, it would go down to lower phonics principles, maybe like beginning sounds. Now, the items in this subtest, 1/2 of them are real items, real words, and 1/2 are nonsense words. So if a student hears the word nap, and you know the word nap, then I got the word nap because I know the word, not because I know the phonics principle nap. Now, if I heard a fake word like nup, and the student gets it right, then I know they had to use short vowel principle in order to figure that out. So it's interesting. I did give you a sample handout, but on the reports you'll see it'll say percent of errors, real words, percent of errors, non-words. When you start seeing older students that have stronger word recognition skills, generally speaking, you'll see that all their errors are on nonsense words or non-real words. And that just makes sense because, we have to use that technique because this is an assessment and we need to do it so that we can isolate whether they're really knowing the phonics principle or not. And that's just a little something I wanted to just let you know. Okay, so once again, we go up and down until we find a phonics principle, until we know where their mastery level is at, and hopefully we have a good idea of their phonics ability. All right, after this subtest, the next one is going to be phonemic awareness. I'm not sure how good this is going to come across on the webinar, so bear with me here. I'll turn up the volume a little bit.
Say the word cat. What do you get when you change k to p? Cap. At. Pat. Pack.
Okay, so phonemic awareness is given to all students K2. Okay, if they're older than 2, grade 2, like grade 3 and above, they are not given the subtest unless they're low in some decoding subtest. So it's a little complicated how it chooses it. It's not always as clear. Sometimes it can be low in hyperlinks words. Sometimes they can be low in something else. But needless to say, this is a pure auditory task. Now, it is a little hard, right? If you have a younger student, they hear something, what's the middle sound, the word cat, or whatever it may be, that's a difficult task because there's a little memory involved. There's also following instructions. So in a sense, this subtest has biases, right? If the student is young and they can't really hear instructions very well, or their memory is maybe not as developed, they'll have a hard time being able to answer questions right. So because of those reasons, we consider this subtest a screener. Okay, a screener means it has more error. In other words, you can have some false low scores, and I wouldn't really worry about it. The time you want to worry about this score is over time. Let's say you have a student, and over the whole year, their phonics score is low. They're a third grader, and they have consistently their beginning sounds. And I also notice they have low phonemic awareness all the time. Okay, at that point, then I would suspect maybe there's an auditory processing issue. But if the student had low phonics throughout the year, but I noticed that their phonemic awareness was high or okay, then I would say, no, they don't have auditory processing issue. This is just maybe they're getting their phonics confused, or maybe they're a bilingual student and they're getting Spanish and English confused. So by having an additional measure, we can sort of triangulate. Now having an auditory processing issue is very rare. I mean, it's more rare. So it doesn't happen that often. But again, we are diagnostic assessment. We need to try to take everything into consideration. So having an additional measure to triangulate on this is good. For those of you who have a DORA license, we do automatically give you, and anyone who has a DORA license, you automatically get access to the Phonemic Awareness Standalone Assessment. Now that is a full-blown diagnostic, and when you take that assessment, students does 30 or 40 questions. There's an example question for every single task. There's only 3 choices. So that's if you really suspect there's a phonemic awareness issue and you want to test and diagnose someone, then you could use that assessment. All right. Okay. So once we're done with the subtest, we move on to the next one.
Grass.
Grass, oral vocabulary. So this particular subtest, vocabulary is something that's hard to measure, right? This is only, 5 to 10 minutes within the greater DORA assessment. So because it's only 5 or 10 minutes long and, it's vocabulary, which is a hard thing to measure, this particular subtest has a higher margin of error. So if someone gets a 4th grade score, really it's plus or minus 1 year. Could be at 3rd grade, could be 5th grade. So just be aware of that. Now this really is giving you an idea of the student's background, academic background at home. So, if someone has a 4th grade score and they're a 6th grader, generally speaking, say, they're probably speaking around 4th grade level at home, probably with their friends. It has a tendency sometimes the oral vocabulary to develop quickly when students are very young, so it'll jump up. But then it tends to flatten out by 5th grade. And a lot of times vocabulary can not really go up very much for students at urban school districts. So anyway, just be aware of this. Now, this is, again, vocabulary is a hard thing to test. So let's say you had a student who was very interested in science, and they maybe had they really knew a lot of their biology, their different science, they knew terms. That's possible that our assessment may not catch that because we're just a generalized vocabulary measure. I'd love to have a standalone vocabulary measure that was 30 minutes long and really examined it, and maybe in the future we'll do it. But just be aware of that. This is also a hard thing to change. It's hard to make vocabulary go up because it's arguable that you can't just give someone a course and put them on an hour a day and build vocabulary. Really, it's something that has to be throughout the day, multiple teachers, parents. You need a lot of people using vocabulary in order to build it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I talk a lot about vocabulary because I think this is one of the biggest misdiagnosed areas in secondary, middle school, high school, at urban districts. The majority of the students who have reading issues, or maybe about half, it's not really a reading issue, it's a vocabulary issue. And students on benchmark tests, they show up as having low reading ability, but it's really a vocabulary issue. All right, next subtest.
Super work. You're almost done. Book. I'm reading my favorite book. Book.
All right, spelling. So this next subtest. They hear the word in context, they have to spell it. They can use the keyboard on their computer, or they can click on the keyboard here on the screen. Now, these words were chosen to be regular and irregularly spelled words. So that means that, is it T-I-O-N or S-I-O-N? Is it P-H or F? Is it W-H or W? Students have to have exposure to reading in order to get items right. Okay. So with this said, in this particular subtest, generally speaking, it reflects a student's exposure to reading. When a student does have a high score in spelling or at grade level score, it tells me that that student reads a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that it's absolute. Again, there's a bias here. The other thing about spelling is you have to have strong encoding skills for spelling. Even though you're good in phonics, to encode is harder than to decode, right? If I see PH, I could sound it out. If I see F, I can sound it out. But if I tell you to spell funnel, somebody might put F, someone might put PH if I've never seen the word, right? So again, it's exposure. So high spelling score means that they probably read, but a low spelling score doesn't mean they don't read. It could be that they read a lot, but they just have a harder time encoding. So again, there's biases, right? Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on to the next subtest.
This story is called Where Do You Live? Click on the arrow when you're ready to read.
All right, so this last subtest is probably the most important subtest in some ways because, of course, reading, at the end of the day, it's about reading passages. All the other subtests are they feed into this, right? You need decoding skills, you need vocabulary, you need all this to be able to comprehend. Now, I got to tell you, there is no grand unified theory. Dr. McCollum, co-founder of the company with me, when he tells this story, it's pretty interesting. He says there's no grand unified theory about comprehension. Am I reading to read some instructions to put together a table at IKEA? Am I reading because I want to take a test? Am I reading because I want to be able to, talk to someone and debate a relative about the upcoming election? I mean, why am I reading? We designed DORA to predict content course success. That means, okay, so think about it, content course success. That means, can I read 2 chapters of history, read a chapter of science, come back the next day, be successful in my lab, or be successful in my debate, or in my discussion in my class? That's the way we designed it. Okay, with that said, we choose nonfiction genre, which is a harder genre, right? Content courses use your nonfiction. As the passage gets longer, as the grade level goes up, as the Lexile or Flesch-Kincaid level of the passage goes up, which is readability, we make the passage longer. So this is, I think it's a 2nd grade or 3rd grade passage. But if you look at the 12th grade passage, it's about 4 or 5 screens. All right. Now, finally, we don't allow look back. Watch this.
Click Done to hide the story and move on to the questions. Remember, you won't be able to see the story again.
Okay. When I hit the Done button, we don't allow look back. Now, that's controversial, but the reason why we don't is, again, for content reading success, you can't look back when you go in lab. Or, if you're having a debate, I had to read up on a bunch of topics, come to school, do my debate. I can't go back and look at all the books I was reading. I have to process that information. So this tells us something about the students. Now, the other thing about our assessment, there's no time limit on reading. So yes, you could say, a lot of benchmark tests, they allow students to look back, but a lot of times those are timed, okay? This is an untimed situation. In an untimed situation, if you do allow look back, statistically we have found that it really, it makes the score spike and puts more variance in them. So statistically, we've learned that, because we used to allow look back in some cases, we learned that if you do allow look back in our particular format of our assessment, it makes the scores just completely inaccurate. So with that said, we don't allow look back. Be aware when students do well on it, should make you feel confident that they will do better in content reading courses because of these various reasons. Longer passages, nonfiction genre, which is harder, no look back. That makes me feel good. This student is going to be prepared for middle school and high school. All right. Next thing, a couple more things actually.
Click dot number 1. Why do people live in cities? A, they don't like animals. B, they don't like museums and theaters. C, they like to be near a lot of people. Or D, they like peace and quiet.
Okay, notice that we read the questions to the students, right? At this point, if I was doing a live training, I like asking people why they think we read the question out loud. And if someone gets it right, we give them a prize. It's sort of a fun, interactive, but I don't have a poll question in here. So just think to yourself, why do you think we would read the question? Okay. Now I'm going to tell you the answer. This is modeled after a silent reading comprehension assessment. So in a silent reading comprehension assessment, you give a student a passage, they read the passage, and then afterwards, as a test taker, test administrator, I would say, so tell me, John, or Steve in this case, why do people live in cities? And then that student would answer the questions. Well, that basically, the reason why we do that is for students who struggle in reading, we're trying to isolate just their reading comprehension. We don't want the question to bias. So maybe they missed the question because they couldn't read the question, right? So the control for that, all questions have audio support. And so it's just something to be aware of. And it's good for you to know that all questions have audio support. There are cases, and I've seen some cases, where you have some students who really cannot read, but they have such good coping skills and they have maybe really strong background knowledge that sometimes they can brute force their way through a couple passages, right? Maybe usually it's lower. But it's interesting. We've seen some cases like that. And when the teachers in a group, we look at the student, they'll say, yes, that's that student. He really doesn't like reading. He struggles, but he'll just cope and he'll just figure things out because he perseveres. Of course, they need to deal with the root issue of why he can't read. But anyway, just be aware that's the format. Okay. All right. That is the 7 subtests of DORA. So let me just do a quick review. Biases. Comprehension the scores can tend to be lower. Actually, there's one other important point I forgot to mention. Okay. Because there's longer passages, nonfiction passages, no look back, it tends to push the scores down. Now, here's the thing I'm sorry I forgot to mention. In our passages, we do not embed high vocabulary into them. So if a student were to read, the eloquent man gave a speech, blah, 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 we would not put a question in there. Did the audience think he spoke well? Now, we do that for a reason, because we're trying to isolate comprehension strategies, and we also have a separate vocabulary measure. So we write our passages a little artificial. That's not normal. Normally, an 8th grade passage has 8th grade vocabulary, but we don't do that. We pull the vocabulary out, and we try to keep it lower. It's still 8th grade passage based on sentence complexity, length of sentences, number of syllables in a word. So we are leveled through Lexile and Flesch-Kincaid. Now, this is really important because we can identify students who have low vocabulary but high comprehension strategy, which I told you is one of those really misdiagnosed categories. All urban schools, so many students fall in this category, and unfortunately, we're not really doing a lot to help those students, because by the time they try to take the SAT, they're going to have a very hard time because their vocabulary is going to be low, and that's really going to hurt them on that assessment. Anyway, so that's the other bias there. Students with low vocabulary can actually do well on our assessment. So sometimes you'll see students with a higher score than you expect. I wouldn't really call that a bias. I would call that, nature of our assessment, so we can identify those students. Word recognition, in general, once students nail it down, this score shoots up. So you're going to see a high word rec score. Spelling tends to be low because students I think we're just not as good spellers. We have so much spell checking, and sometimes we don't teach spelling integrated with reading at lower grades, so it becomes something that's a harder task. Oral vocabulary tends to be high for younger students, K1, K1, 2, but then it does tend to flatten out. This is a report here. This is one of the handouts actually we have. But let's just look at a report here together, and then maybe a couple questions will pop up. So if I look at this report here, this is a third grader. I see that they have low third grade sight words, okay? Mid second grade phonics. So they're, even though we say they're on grade level, they're really a little bit low. But this mid-second grade, remember I told you once students sort of nail down decoding, the score tends to shoot up. So even though we say this is okay, I would be a little worried. I say the student struggles a little bit with decoding. They're sort of on the cusp, right? And then we see exactly where we need to work. Vocabulary is okay. And then, so really this student needs a little bit of work in decoding. We need to make sure that their phonics keeps up because it's on the verge of being low. And then of course they need comprehensive strategies. All right, so here we go. We have some questions. Sorry, I think I was looking at the wrong area here. That's my fault. Are we going to go through how to read the score results? Yeah, we're doing that right now. So I'll go through some more scores as well. And the next question is, what are some of the signifiers that cause a student older than second grade to be given the Phonemic Awareness test? Yeah, so if somebody was older than second grade, like this particular student here, they're a third grader, right? And the reason why they were given phonemic awareness is because they're marginally low, I think, in word rec. A lot of times, if they're definitely low in high frequency words, they would be given it. But this student is sort of marginally low in word recognition, and so it was turned on. We really look at a combination of all three of these, right? And it's not a hard, because scores can be so different and we're dealing with three variables, sometimes it seems a little bit like, oh, why are they turning it on? Why are they turning it off? But anyway, and if you do suspect a student is you worry about it, then I would give them a standalone assessment and you can clear it up right away. Because a standalone assessment it's diagnostic. There's enough questions to remove margin of error for test taking and so on and so forth. Another question is, the only subtest that is timed is high frequency words. Okay, so this is the only one that is timed right here. So what that means is, again, they hear the word, they have about 4 seconds to click on it. Now, in general, these subtests right here, the decoding ones, are very reliable. The reason why I say they're reliable is because they're very easy. You hear a word, you click on it. The, click. Of, click. And, click. You have short vowels. Nap, click. Mat, click. So in general, they're very, very reliable. Students, even if someone's really not motivated, not trying, they almost, they're going to still click when they hear a word, right? The ones that have higher variability are going to be vocabulary because it's harder to test, spelling because it's a hard task, and comprehension because, again, that's a hard task. Students sometimes poop out and they don't want to try in the comprehension passage. Sometimes it's not bad to break the assessment over multiple tests, multiple sessions. Maybe you stop, you tell them when you get to the passages, take a break, and maybe the second day you have them do the passages. All right, another question just came up. So what if students attend a private school and they do not follow Common Core standards? Does this assessment apply? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with DORA, we are testing the reading process. We do align to the Common Core, but we're not, in our comprehension level, really, we're just trying to see what grade level passage can student comprehend. We're looking at all these decoding skills. These are skills that we need to know about when we teach reading. Yes, some of the Common Core, I think they talk about high frequency words, they talk about phonics, but that's, all standards sort of do. But again, our test was designed for reading as a process. And DORA in particular was also designed before Common Core, actually. So that was a good question. All right, so what I'm going to do too is I'm going to wait for more questions to pop up, and we do have some time. So let me actually log into a demo account. All right, so hopefully you could see that. Let me go ahead and maximize my screen right here. So right here, we're looking at a class. This is a third grade class. You see most of these students were not given phonemic awareness. A couple of them were right here. So this is an interesting one. Look at this student. Now, these are all fictitious students. Names have been changed. I think these are old assessment, real data that we pulled over, but then we changed all the names and so on and so forth. But if we look at this one here, we see Sophie is third grade. Her sight words are low, and she's low in phonics as well. If I click on the question mark, I can actually see what a 1.83 is. She's mastered consonant blends, but she's working on long vowel. Okay. And now look at this, 78% phonemic awareness. That's good. I know it's hard to get a false high score, right? Most scores tend to be low in phonemic awareness, so I'm not worried about an auditory processing issue. But I do realize she needs to work on both areas. She needs to work on memorizing those sight words, and she needs to work on her phonics. Undoubtedly, if she starts working on that, it'll probably boost up her comprehension. Because of course, if you're decoding at this level, you're going to have a hard time. It's very distracting. You're trying to decode, hard time processing what you're reading, right? This is more typical for third graders. We start seeing some of these scores shooting up. 8th grade, 6th grade, right? They've mastered sight words. 3.83, that's the maximum score. The student's pretty high phonics. Now look at the difference here, though. This student has a 9.17. This student has a 1.17. So in general, this student needs to work on comprehension strategies. They're good at decoding. Vocabulary is okay. They need to work on making meaning from text, where this student's already sort of nailed down. This is a student, I would say, they're an independent reader. I don't need to diagnose them anymore, right? They're going to be pushing forward really well. We also have this profile letter, and sometimes people actually ask about that. And let me just show you what it is. If I click on Display Class Profile, this is where we can put students into instructional groups. So what we're saying here is these are the independent readers. These are the students C who you need to work on comprehension strategies. So this is the traditional, maybe you have some curriculum that's focused on comprehension strategies. B and A would be the students who are still working a lot on decoding, and as a result, their comprehension is still also low. The G students are going to be the students who are good in decoding, good in comprehension, but low in vocabulary. You don't see as many students like this in a third grade class. This group, this bar starts growing when you start getting into 5th, 6th, and above grade. You start seeing this one grow up, and then you see C and D go up. If I click on G, I can see who the student is right here. Matt, good at decoding, good in comprehension strategy, but very low vocabulary. Now, initially, I'd also wonder, did Matt try? Maybe he, at that point, he got distracted, but if you see it over time and consistently, he takes another assessment later on, and you see that it's still low, then yeah, he's got a low vocabulary, and that's gonna really affect him on any state test or any benchmark test, or even reading books. He's gonna have a hard time if his vocabulary is that low. Okay, let's see if there's more questions. Oh yeah, a couple more questions. Great. When the word recognition is below grade level in the example you are discussing now, and the student was given phonemic awareness, and we do have some boxes unchecked, then why do we have a green check mark for word recognition? Is the student given some benefit of doubt here? Absolutely. This is the thing about an assessment like this, is that I think what you're saying is the student was given phonemic awareness, but the word recognition was still, in theory, okay. Yeah, in this particular case, this is within 1 year. So there's a third grader beginning, so they're given the test at 3.0 beginning of the year. It's plus or minus a year. So if they're within a year, we consider the checkbox is okay. Part of it is just there's margin of error. So we sort of have to say, yes or no, that's okay. That's why we do this data interpretation training, because when I look at all three, in this case, they're low here, low here. When they're a third grader, you really expect the score to shoot up. So I would say that this is actually low as well. But because we have to deal with the report and it deals with all grades, we deal with the standard thresholds, we sort of say it's okay. But again, you sort of have to interpret it a little bit. Are these assessments good for K? Okay, so here's the thing about DORA. At K, beginning of year K, it's not going to tell you too much, because this is a beginning reading assessment. So it's not an emergent reader assessment. Technically, at the beginning of K, an emergent reader assessment says concepts about print, uppercase, lowercase? Do they know their words, letters? Do they know their beginning sounds? Do they know their sight words? So this isn't going to necessarily tell you as much diagnostically, but it can tell you which students are readers, and it can isolate and verify that some kids who come in at K are good readers. But I would say, generally speaking, in K, maybe you start at the middle of the year, right? After they had some time, they work on the computer a little bit, they know how to use the mouse, and you've been working on sight words. And then, there's some definitely sight words, beginning sounds, vocabulary. Those are all good things to look at. If a student is in K and they have the lowest level of sight words, they have non-mastery of all these decoding areas, we will not give them spelling and we will not give them a passage. So the test is very fast. Okay. The longest time an assessment can take, it's the struggling middle school student who has all these spikes in their skills, or somebody who's a really advanced reader and just keeps going higher and higher and higher. I mean, I've seen assessments take an hour and a half. Some students are very, very conscientious, could take 2 hours, but most students do it within an hour. But the thing too is you should definitely proctor the assessment and just keep an eye on students. You don't want someone overly analyzing every single word here. I mean, if they hear the word, they should be able to click on it fast. Some students just, they're too worried about getting a wrong answer, and so you need to make sure those students know through the proper introduction of what you're doing that they don't do that. What is the reason the student would not be tested in spelling? That's exactly what I just mentioned. This student, Sandra, look at this. 0.5 is a non-mastery of the first level of sight words. Our first level of words and sight words is first grade. Our first level of word recognition items is first grade, and then we're beginning sounds. No sight words, that means she doesn't even know and, of, a, right? Non-mastery, okay? Word rec's very low. Beginning sounds, she knows some beginning sounds, or a lot of them. So this student's going to struggle with reading a passage, so we turn off spelling and we turn off comprehension passages. The last question is abbreviation. So if you ever don't know what they stand for, HF, click right here, is high frequency words, score range 0.5 to 3.83. This is the only time subtest, right? So you just click on the question mark. This is word recognition, phonics, phonemic awareness, spelling, vocabulary, comprehension, and so on and so forth. So if you ever forget, also, by the way, you see these little arrows? It's really cool. You can click on the arrows, and I could sort high to low, low to high. So this student here is working on beginning sounds. This student's working on, I think, long vowel, diphthongs, or multisyllabic syllables. But of course, if you want to see, you can click on the question mark, and we could see, okay, 4.5, they have diphthongs mastered, but they're working on multiple syllables. But 1.5, they have short vowel master, they're working on consonant blends. Okay. And this is also apparent in the class, in any of the individual student reports. We have that little box with the check boxes. Okay. The question is about a score of 0. Sometimes some students in phonics will get a 0. A 0 doesn't mean they didn't get anything right. It means that they got a non-mastery on that set, on the lowest level set. They may still got a couple questions right, a couple beginning sounds, but it just means that they have the lowest level, that probably out of a set of 10, maybe they got only 2 or 3 items right. So it was a very low, where somebody who has something slightly higher, maybe it means they got almost a mastery, which is 70% or higher, but maybe they got, 6 out of 10. All right, so there's certain levels that it goes with. So the question is, if we pre-purchase the Phonemic Awareness Assessment, will students be enrolled in it? No. Anytime you buy any of our assessments, so if you're buying it by fixed test packs, you have to actually consciously enroll the students in a test. So this is my demo account. So let's say I see Harvey. I go to View Queue. I have it here, DORA Phonemic Awareness. This is the Phonemic Awareness. I would have to, if I bought a 100 pack, I'd actually have to click Update Queue and actually enroll him. It will never automatically enroll. Our system used to automatically enroll students when students were added, but we stopped that many years ago. Just once we started having so many assessments, you have to actively enroll a student, and that's how you do it. So if I want to enroll him in another DORA assessment, or he's already enrolled, ready. If I want to enroll him in an ADAM assessment, I click here, hit Update. If I want to do it for my entire class, I go over here to View Class Queue. So this is my class of, however number of kids I have, students. I can now activate DORA Spanish for my entire class by clicking that button. So you're saying you have a lot of students like Janice Peters. So let me find Janice Peters. Okay, let's take a look. Yeah, it is interesting to examine students, you know. Let's see here. Interesting. Okay, so the only thing I'd say about Janice is Janice, when he took this assessment, Janet was a end of first grade. I actually think this is probably a false low score in PA because the reality is for K and first graders, it's hard to do the phonemic awareness assessment subtest. Excuse me. It's a hard task. You got to hear like say what's the middle sound in the word cat, or take the word pat, change the p to m. You know that's a hard thing. So I think you get a lot of false lows. But because a student actually has phonics, is actually doing well in phonics, this student is working in phonics, they're mastering phonics. But you know, when you read English, you can't just use phonics skills. You actually have to memorize a bunch of words because there's a lot of words that are irregular, that don't follow phonics rules. So this student needs to work on sight word memorization. And the student needs to realize you can't just use phonics to decode everything. You also have to just memorize words. And I think that's this student here. Now, there's two things going on. Either this student doesn't have good sight word skills, or this is a false low score, right? So it's possible in this case, because Janice has such high comprehension for his grade level, I would suspect this could be a false low score. So maybe, you know, a lot of students, when they all started taking an assessment in a lab such situation, maybe it was too noisy, they weren't paying attention. You know, it's also possible to have a big batch of students have low high frequency words because that's the only subtest that is timed. So hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, the students are given assessment questions based on their grade level and their current operating level. Why do we need a date of birth for each student? All right, so the reason why we use a date of birth is because if I see a student, you know, I look at their scores, the date of birth tells us, looking at their grades doesn't always tell us a lot, especially at a first grade level. If I see that the student is really older for their grade, that's why I want to know their date of birth. Because from a developmental standpoint, you know, a first grader who is really a second grader, or they're a very old first grader versus a first grader who is young for first grade, is big developmentally. And so that's what it tells me a little bit is sometimes grades are off. And so sometimes I want to know the date of birth. And that's why, I mean, I guess we've always defaulted to having a date of birth because I think reading specialists by default, they always want to know, oh, how old is this child? They don't really always want to know about grade. They want to know, oh, how old is this child? Oh, they're 6. Okay, oh, they're 7. Especially nowadays that we teach students to read in fifth grade, kindergarten, right? It's a little early. Some kids are not developmentally ready to learn to read in K. And if I see I have a low K, someone who's really young, just turned 5, or maybe they're 4, then I'd have a totally different impression than somebody who is high 5, maybe they're almost 6, and they're both in kindergarten. Okay, so next question. We serve predominantly English learners. What role does that play in Janice Peters-like students? If Janice Peters, let's say he's EL, one the role could play, and you feel like, no, this is valid. It could be that some students, when they initially starting to learn English, they were taught, you need to learn your phonics, you need to learn how to sound everything out. And so maybe they have this misconception that everything could be decoded based on phonics. So in a case like a student like that, I would say, hey, you know what? I would actually, well, I don't know about first grader, but maybe they're older. Sometimes I'd consider printing out the report and say, hey, you know what? You're doing a great job. Let's say Janice was a little older. Let me just bring this up. Like I said, the trend is nowadays to actually share reports with students. But, you know, if they're in first grade, you know, that's something you got to consider whether you're going to do that or not. But I would say, hey, look, you're doing great. You have a mid-4th grade phonics, right? You're doing really, really well. It's way above your grade level. Your word recognition skills great, but your high frequency word skills are low. And I would explain what that means. There are words that cannot be sounded out. And those words you just need to memorize. And so English is weird. It's got a combination, a lot of irregular words. And so I would explain that and make sure that they know they need another strategy for decoding. You can't just have phonics. You have to have also memorization of words. But actually, you know, even with this student here, first grader, there are so many green check boxes. This looks good. The issue here is that as far as a follow-up to Janice Peters, the student with low but there's a few students are speaking Arabic at home. Yes, with some languages they're very different. Then like Spanish at least has a lot of similarities. Some words you can figure out, some are similar, but Arabic might be very different, or Asian language. But still, you know what? For any of those students who are speaking different languages at home, I think one of the things I try to do is, if we take a look at a student here, if we look at the parent report, and let's say you're sharing reports with families, okay? Now, I wouldn't necessarily always print this whole report. This parent report is 9 pages. But if you go to page 9, I would print this page out. I would give parents the summary report, and I also give them this report here. And so we want to start making sure people understand that reading is not a single skill. What level is my child reading at? Oh, they're reading at 4th grade level. No. Okay, reading is multiple skills. So this is a great thing to keep on hand. Print out a bunch of Appendix A's and keep them handy. So if someone says, what can I do with my child at home? Or you give them the summary report and you give them a copy of this. Say, hey, look, this is the area you need to work on for your child. They need to start memorizing certain words that are irregular phonics patterns. Okay. A lot of great questions. This is awesome. Thank you so much. DORA Comprehension Subtest Analysis Report. This is a great one. Let's go ahead, and if I want to see how long my students are taking reading passages, so I could display this report, and now I can actually see how much time they're taking. Okay, and this is my demo account, so they don't have times here, but normally what happens is it'll say how many minutes they spent reading a passage and how much time they spent reading questions. I think what happened in this case, we transferred this data for a demo account so that the reading times are all gone. But normally, you look at it and sometimes you realize, hey, this student's taking 1 minute to read a 3rd grade passage. That's not, most people should spend 3 minutes, and so on and so forth. And so you can know whether someone actually tried. When it has a low score here at 4 seconds, that means the student probably didn't try reading. They just answered the questions and guessed. And you can see that from this case here. All right, I think that's it. We're out of time. Thank you very much. And thank you, Aaron, for organizing.